And therefore, these are the reactionary bloc. Now, the reactionary bloc has a strategy that is so-called elections, which have started to be run now. Nobody expects from these elections that they will change things radically. Elections usually do not change things. There is always a conservative dimension of elections, of the so-called majorities. But the strategy of the movement is different. It is based on the idea that the legitimacy of continuing the struggle is far more important than the so-called legitimacy of elections. Therefore, there is the possibility, but only the possibility, of the Egyptian movement, if it continues, with victories and defeats, as usual in history, with advances and retreats, to crystallize into a new wave, or a new wave of the springtime of the Egyptian and possibly other people around.
And I work a lot in Latin America, and there are a lot of popular movements and also popular governments to the centre-left and left that have sprung up in the last 15 years. And one of the biggest challenges that they confront is often states which are very much in the hands of counter-revolutionary forces and comprador bourgeoisies linked into the world system, which it sounds like the Egyptian case is also confronting. So I suppose my question for you is a strategic one and a theoretical one, in the sense of, to what extent, therefore, do you think that to transform the autumn of capitalism into springs in these places, should forces be focusing on building alternative institutions that democratize society, or should they be focusing upon trying to gain power within the state?
Yeah, you see, you are fully right. The challenge started not in the Arab countries, but in Latin America 20 years ago. It started with the first election of Chavez and the election of Lula, and then the changes in Ecuador and Bolivia. And these changes have been the result of very strong popular movements. Without those strong popular movements, none of those leaders, Chavez, Lula, Correa, Evo Morales, would have won the elections. The elections came as a result of the change, or initiating changes in the balance of forces at the level of civil society through the organization of people. The result was not negligible, in the sense that governments have changed. But governments is something, and state is something more wider. The state have not changed. The bureaucracies, the judicial system, the etc. have not changed. And therefore, we are now, the people of Latin America, of South America, are facing a new challenge. They have a government which is not so bad, which is at least much better than what they had before, but with a state which have, with very limited changes. And the relation between that state and the movement, which continues, are very complex. Now, what would be, in my opinion, there are different disasters which we should try to avoid. One would be that the movements stop, and that they just support the governments that they have been able to put in place as they are, in office as they are, and accept to be subordinate to them. But the other would be the opposite, that they come into a conflict which would lead to the breakdown of those shaky governments in those countries, full of contradictions. Now, there is a tendency for the governments to try to adjust to the global system, not as well as possible. I mean, to enlarge a little the room, the space for maneuver, but not much more than that. To be realistic, that would be their language. It's always the language of the ruling people. Let us be realistic. But there is also the danger of the movements not understanding that everything cannot be achieved in a few weeks or months or even years, that the movement has to continue. The dialectic between adjusting to the system or moving beyond the system. Now, you have both of them. You know, I think that Mao summarized the challenge better than anybody else when he said that people, the sentence is the following, and I shall explain it, what it means. People want revolution, nations liberation, state independence. Let us start the other way around. By state, what is meant are the ruling classes. What does it mean they want independence? They want a room of maneuver within the global system, but they accept the global system, which means they accept capitalism. And we can see it, including in the emerging countries, including in China itself today. If they are able to create a room of maneuver, they become nationalistic. I mean, they use this room of maneuver. If they have no room of maneuver, they just operate as comprador, subordinate. And we can see the two cases in South America. We have the comprador system of Colombia, and we have the nationalistic state of or power system of Venezuela, or of Bolivia, or of Ecuador. So you have the two. Now, nation means, now I move to the people. By people, what Mao meant are the popular classes. That is the variety of people who are de facto subordinated, exploited, oppressed in a variety of ways and means, which are, lato sensu, the proletariat. The proletariat is not just to be reduced to the industrial workers of modern industry, but a variety of forms. They want revolution. What does it mean? It means that they cannot be satisfied. Capitalism cannot answer to their fundamental problems. Capitalism is producing for them, and we can see it, growing pauperization. And therefore they are potentially socialist. Potentially. They are not spontaneously socialist, but they are potentially. And in between the state, that is the ruling classes, as they are, on the one hand, and the popular classes which are exploited by global monopoly capital, you have the nation. This is another level of reality, which means that there is, because in its expansion, capitalism has not only exploited labor, it has also attacked and destroyed identities, including national identities, call it as you want. And therefore, the process of emancipation is not just a process of getting rid of economic exploitation by capital, but also emancipation of nations as such. One of the demands of the Egyptian movement is very interesting to see. One of the slogans was dignity. What is that? It is not synonymous to exploitation and oppression. It's more than that.
Yeah, dignity is a big motivating factor amongst Latin American movements as well. But I think, so you've talked quite intricately about the contradictions between the levels of the people, the state, the nation. And you've talked about the strategy of delinking as a way in which you might construct sort of anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist formations in different nation states. But if we know that many of these states are so heavily embedded as comprador states, as those reinforcing capitalism and limiting popular energies, do you think that actually the delinking strategy could work to construct this, or maybe you would need sort of network. There's a lot of discussion about network connections across different groups.
You see, the question is a very complex one. Delinking is not a magic formula. You decide to delink, you delink, and all problems are solved. Delinking means trying, an attempt. And when one says an attempt, it means it is always relative, and you have never success 100%. If you succeed, you can succeed 20%, 50%, 70%, depending on the conditions. Succeeding in what? In reversing the relation. Instead of being compelled to adjust to the global system, which is what you correctly analyze as compradorization. You accept your subordinate place, and you have a ruling class which is a subordinate class of comprador. Instead of reversing the relation and compelling the global system to adjust to the demands of which correspond to the emancipation or gradual emancipation of the popular classes from exploitation and oppression, of the nations to reestablish their dignity and their participation, and of the states as active agents in the shaping of the world. That is the concept of delinking. Why there is no alternative to delinking? Because the change at the global level will not occur equally. I mean, it will not be achieved through a consensus of a UN General Assembly and the governments deciding for the best, the good solution for the whole mankind. This is very naive. It will not even be achieved regionally. Look at what is happening in Europe. I mean, the growing conflict between Germany and Greece, for instance, to take that example today. And therefore, what is needed is in the centers, that is in the triad, United States, Canada, Europe, Western Europe, Central Europe, and Japan, to build gradually, this is what is meant by being audacious, an anti-monopoly alternative historical bloc, anti-monopoly. And in the peripheries, Asia, Africa, and Latin America, an anti-comprador alternative bloc. Now, you will never have, within a few weeks or months, a perfect alternative. You will have something in between, which have ingredient of the alternative, but which have still under the influence of reactionary forces present within the system. And since no such anti-monopoly alternative bloc or anti-comprador monopoly bloc will occur, will be achieved by a miracle at the global level or at a regional level, you need for those countries which happen to be able to make some advances more than others, to create for themselves a margin of maneuver. And that is the meaning of delinking.
Often the whole idea of a sort of anti-comprador bloc in the peripheries and the sort of the completing of modernity by sort of forms of developmentalism and industrialization, that would be part of this. To what extent is that your view? And is that to some extent ignoring many of the analyses that look at the environmental costs and impacts of that version of modernity?
Yes, no, you see, I don't think that I ignore environmental problems and ecology, but we have to connect them to the need for development. The word development is a bad one because it has been de facto by the dominant ideology considered as synonymous to widening of the markets, the expansion of markets, which means expansion of capitalist markets. But if we look at development as a process of emancipation of individuals, of collectives, of classes, of nations, and so on, then we have another vision of development. Now, development is full of contradictions. We cannot imagine the peripheries remaining, for instance, non-industrialized. They have moved into industrialization, but while moving into industrialization to go fast, they have been reproducing patterns of industrialization which convey capitalist relations of production and which convey, along with those capitalist relations of production, destruction of the ecological conditions. Now, we need to gradually move beyond that pattern of industrialization and so-called, let us call it modernization, which will take account and will give substance to the ecological challenge, among others. But many you can associate there all the dimensions of the challenges.
Okay, so you talk about an expanded version of development that's not purely a bourgeois development because of its destructive nature for peoples, for land, for ecology. What would you see as the role of religion in a sort of emancipating reason project?
Well, you see, I am in defense of secularism, that is separating the question of political power from religion, which doesn't mean that you abolish religion. Religion and spirituality have been throughout the history continuously submitted to the targets of the ruling classes, to reactionary targets. And that goes not only with Islam, for instance, it has been the case for Christianity, for Buddhism, for any other big or smaller religion. Now, there have been always other understanding of religion, particularly in movements which mobilized people in their struggle for emancipation. But in order to have that possibility of a progressive understanding of religion, you have to separate it from the question of the political power. And it is there that secularism becomes a very important ingredient of democratization of the society.
You're very critical of political Islam and its sort of relationship in general, not completely, with more reactionary forms of politics.
You see, political Islam is reactionary Islam. It's not just Islam. It is the reactionary understanding. Well, political Islam, there are many different parties which belong to this family. I don't want to oversimplify, but the dominant forces, such as the Muslim Brotherhood, for instance, which is not exclusively Egyptian, but which has been disseminating in most Arab and Muslim countries, and Nahda, for instance, in Tunisia, is similar. But FIS in Algeria was also a very reactionary understanding of Islam. All those political Islam today is dominated by the Wahhabi understanding of Saudi Arabia of Islam, which is the most primitive reactionary understanding of religion. Now, you can go back to the history of Europe, and you would find in the history of Europe similar use of religion by reactionary forces. After all, during the 19th century, I'm speaking of those parties which claimed to be Christian parties and which were just the parties, the political forces in service of the bourgeoisie, which was subordinate to the targets of the bourgeoisies, of capital. So we have to be very cautious about that. Today, political Islam in general belongs to the reactionary alliance. In the case of Egypt, it is very clear. I mean, facing the movement, you have the reactionary bloc with the command of the army, with the parties, the reactionary parties of Egyptian capital, and with the Muslim Brotherhood.
How do you ensure that this doesn't become something that can be used by imperialist forces to legitimize Islamophobia?
You see, unfortunately, Islamophobia exists, just as I would say anti-Semitism exists. But there are two blackmailing that we should not accept. One is the blackmailing of those Zionists, for instance, who assimilate any criticism of Israel as a state and of Zionism as anti-Semitism. This is blackmailing. The same with Islamophobia. Criticizing the political Islam as reactionary political force is not Islamophobia at all, and we should not accept this blackmailing. The proof of it is that in Egypt you have a very interesting debate which I think will develop. There has been a traditional Egyptian understanding of Islam, which is Sufi Islam, which is an Islam which is very open-minded and tolerant, which is totally different from Wahhabi Islam of the Muslim Brotherhood. And there is a conflict between the two which is growing now.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I was going to talk about Hezbollah, for example, and what you thought about. I mean, I have colleagues and compañeros who are working around with Hezbollah, and they would talk about the new forms of democratizing society that are being combined with that interpretation of Islam. How would you?
Yes, you see, we should be very careful not generalizing too much, and looking at each case. You know, Hezbollah in Lebanon is very different from Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, because it is facing the immediate challenge, the challenge of Israel and of the Zionist attacks on Lebanon. And therefore, it is in a position of defense of the nation against the Zionist aggression. It's very different. The Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, because they accept global capitalism as it is, they accept the rule of the market. They have taken the most reactionary positions against the strikes of the working class strikes, against the movements of the small peasants resisting to expropriation and so on. By doing so, they also accept de facto the ruling of the US over the region. And if they accept the ruling of the US over the region, they accept also further expansion of Zionist colonization of Palestine. But they cannot say that. They hide it because they cannot appear as they are, that they belong to the reactionary bloc, which includes the three good friends, the three best friends. United States, I'm speaking of the government, the ruling class,